Hi, everybody. So I don't know if Heather can hear me or not.
I can. I'm sorry, I just stepped away to get it.
Okay. So before we start off, I just wanted to, since normally when living room conversations are single conversations, they go through the whole original, like getting to know each other phase. And with this conversation set, the assumption is made that the people kind of went through that in the first conversation. And then in the second conversation, they kind of move past that a little bit and then go into the meat of the conversation a little bit earlier. And then in the wrap up conversation, obviously we have, by that point, had two conversations. So it's just a little bit more meat if we want it to be. So I just kind of give you a heads up on that. So I'm not going to ask you like what motivates you or what your best friend will say about you or anything like that. We'll just kind of get into it. And and I know Shakira is going to edit all this part out, right? So are you doing the editing? Right. Okay. So she's going to be editing that part out so we can kind of do that logistical part. So does everyone have the conversation guide near them or accessible enough that they can? Okay, cool. All right. And what we'll do is we'll go over the conversation agreements just to remind people who will be watching the videos in the future, and then we'll get into the conversation. So after I have this sip of tea. All right. So hi, everybody. Welcome back to the part 2 of our race and ethnicity conversation with Living Room Conversations. Good to see everybody again. It's not common to have a conversation with the same group of people and then a week later have another conversation. So it's just looking forward to this, and maybe in the past week, maybe some depth has been built where we've thought about this and anticipate this conversation. So I'd love to hear about that as we kind of proceed. But as we get started, we'll go through our conversation agreements. I don't know if you have those in front of you, so I will just kind of go through them. So conversation agreement number 1 is to be curious and to be open to learning. Next one's show respect and suspend judgment. A lot of times we tend to judge, and that's normal, but we try to help everyone feel respected in this space. So we try not to overtly judge. We also look for common ground, but also noting differences. And then we try to be as authentic as possible with each other. And hopefully, since last week, we feel comfortable doing that. Be purposeful and to the point, and own and guide the conversation. So even though I'm talking right now, it's not like I'm in charge of the conversation. We're all in ownership of the conversation. And hopefully through our interactions, we'll develop ways to engage and kind of feel our way through it. And even though I have everyone muted, everyone's muted right now just for background noise purposes, feel free to kind of pop in. I feel like we might know each other enough that if you feel like you have to pop in, just go ahead and do that. And if there's some background noise, I may mute you just because it's maybe popping in. But if you do feel like you have to say something, let's just feel free to go ahead and do that. And John, I don't know if I can't see you in terms of video right now, and if can come on video, that's great. If you can't, we'll just listen for your voice. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so we can go ahead and get the conversation started. Does anyone want to start us off with the first point in the conversation?
Can everyone hear me first and foremost? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I still have that issue, even with an LRC that I did over the past weekend. Prior to us getting into the round questions, the meat part of the conversation, I did kind of want to ask, because some of you may have a better understanding than I do. I've always I've noticed differences between race and ethnicity, but I've never been able to clearly define the difference between the two.
Yeah.
Or understand what ethnicity is outside of nationality, because those two were taught to me hand in hand. So I wanted to know, before we start, does anybody have anything that could like help me understand, or like have you kind of discovered a clear definition of what ethnicity is?
I don't have a clear, a clear definition, but I definitely view living in the South as an ethnicity in America, at least because I was not born in the South, but I've been here now for like 18 years. So for me, like that there's a sort of, the sense of always being an outsider, even though this has been my home for almost like 2 decades or whatever. So for me, that's just like an expanded view of like ethnicity, besides like my family came from whatever random country or whatever. I don't know if that is helpful at all, but to me, like that's one of those like identifiers or whatever that is sort of involved with this broader view of ethnicity.
Shannon is ethnically Southern. Is that what I heard you? Is that what I heard you say?
I'm more like a nomad, but but I in terms of the way people view themselves, and the idea of further in the conversation, there's a question about this idea of like passing off an ethnicity that maybe isn't yours or whatever. That had me thinking in terms of my experience of living in the South as someone who was not born here or whatever, and just the way that people identify themselves.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. My understanding of ethnicity is that it is essentially one's, I guess, cultural group within a racial group. Although it's kind of difficult to be very exact about that, because you certainly can't have a person who's of one race who, through what we perceive to be a race, who manages to grow up or kind of be adopted into the culture of another racial group. And so, if you're a white person who's been raised in an African American family or community, for instance, are you not you might be culturally African American. I've known white folks like that, and I've known black people going the other way, and so their ethnic trappings beyond their physical appearance are all of one group, even if their race might seem to be another. But race and ethnicity is obviously correlated, but I just look at ethnicity as essentially indicating your cultural features and typically corresponding to a particular sort of, national or nationality or a particular heritage that is generally common to people within a particular ethnic group. So, racially speaking, a person's culture could vary, but ethnicity suggests a particular cultural kind of experience.
I think that's a pretty good definition, but I agree with Shakira, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but the definition of ethnicity seems a little bit subjective. It's how you identify yourself. And I mentioned last time, like, my grandfather came over from Slovakia, and that would have been a very important ethnic definition for him. He would actually speak Slovak, and we learned how to do Slovakian things like make sauerkraut and pierogi and stuff like that. But it was far less strong in my parents, and I've seen lots of data that shows that particularly in the United States, immigrants that come over, the first generation very much embraces who they were before they left their country to come here, but their kids and their grandkids tend to assimilate, and they tend to adopt other cultures and other traditions. And so I feel like ethnicity is a moving target in a lot of ways, whereas race is, you kind of are who you are.
So thanks, Shakir, for bringing that up and starting that off, because there's actually some definitions in the conversation guide up at the top that are common ones and I'll just go through them real quick. And we don't have to buy into them, but these are the ones that we have on the website. One of them is a category of people who identify with each other based on similarities such as common ancestry, language, history, society, culture, or nation. And other ones, an inherited status based on the society in which one lives. Membership of an ethnic group tends to be defined by shared cultural heritage, ancestry, origin, things that we talked about before, including cuisine, dressing style, art, and in some cases, physical appearance. And another definition used is a social group that has a common national cultural tradition, and then one that has a similar language or religion or the like. And there's obviously interplay there, and we'll probably talk about some of those as we go on. So, so we kind of already got started. I don't know if Heather, if you wanted to jump in on it at all in terms of the idea of ethnicity.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you guys covered it all real well. I don't really have anything to add.
So the first question, then I'll just kind of jump into it, is after our conversation last week when we talked about race, has anyone been looking forward to this conversation on ethnicity? Why or why not? And has the previous conversation kind of played in your mind at any point?
I've been looking forward to it, and I was thinking about how little time we have to discuss such a broad subject, you know, and it felt like we just scratched the surface a week ago, and I left feeling like, oh, we really just kind of like got into the introductory part of the whole thing and not really diving into okay, so how we kind of talked about how our personal experiences and kind of like how we grew up and all that, but then, you know, how is that affecting us today and how we live our lives and how we view the world and how we, you know, experience just experience or view racial discord or tensions. And I just felt like I feel like we need 3 sessions just on race, you know, so put that in the suggestion box. But yeah, I've been looking forward to this, and be nice if we could like spin, you know, like if we could continue on. It seems like these things are just like a springboard maybe for a more intense conversation and action. I don't know.
Yeah, this fits a journey that I'm going through because very recently, you know, my parents are dead and my grandparents are dead. Watched this national and probably global conversation about ethnicity and identity and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. Is it the first most important thing, or is it a secondary thing to who we all are as people living together? So I've had to go back and sort of try to reconstruct my ethnic history because, as I said last time, we didn't talk about it that much. I mean, I had these indications, and my grandfather would speak a different language once in a blue moon, but usually when he was swearing at me, by the way. So, and I was being a bad kid. But the argument that we're having as a nation and perhaps as a world right now is what's more important, your ethnic identity and race, and those things, I still think those are sort of complex subjects that everybody thinks about differently, versus what do we all have in common? And I think that commonality is more important than our ethnic identity, but I think that's a very controversial thing to say. And so, yes, I'm very much looking forward to this because I see this argument play out on my Facebook feed every day, which is some of my progressive friends and my libertarian friends and my conservative friends. And sometimes it gets a little uncomfortable because they're not hearing each other at all on this particular subject.
But I just remember coming away from our last conversation thinking like, man, that got real deep. I was sort of surprised by how deep it got, which I shouldn't have been because, you know, I basically work and dialogue myself. But even at that, I just thought everybody's experiences were just incredibly illuminating. And I've just been so busy since last week that I hadn't had much time to really reflect on it other than, just thinking that coming out of the conversation. So it kind of snuck up on me again today. But even so, yeah, I think that you guys are a great group of people. And I guess I was struck by just how much of myself I saw and literally every other person on the call, to my, I'm sorry, man, I forgot your name, with my libertarian brother who just spoke. But Matt, is it? But to your point, it does get to this issue about how much we have in common, and I guess that view is more controversial now than it may have been 30 or 40 years ago. But I do think that people in general, I think, still recognize the importance of highlighting commonality. I'd like to think that they do. A little bit.
Okay. Just in this laptop. This weekend, you guys, I met a Sierra Leonean born woman named Awa who was adopted by a white family when she was 8. When she was in Sierra Leone at the time, prior to the age of 8, the Civil War was going on. And so she was caught in what they would consider to be like rebel and Tutsi fights. And so when she was adopted, of course, at the time she was traumatized, and through therapy and conversations, as I want to say she was 23 or 26 in that age frame, she just said, like, living in America now with her Sierra Leonean past, her white upbringing, and her understanding of what it is to be Black, because a lot of people separate the two, as they should, because they're completely separate experiences, being African, being Black, and of course being white. But it was so incredible to me to meet someone who was born in Africa, was brought here at the age of 8, but was raised by a white family, and has such a unique experience, but such a clear understanding of the things that we're talking about now because of the perspectives that she has been raised around. I just thought that was interesting. But part in what you were saying, Matt, I think that it's controversial to at least prioritize our what's the word? I'm sorry, I'm having baby brain. It can be controversial to prioritize what we have in common versus our differences for a lot of people, because for a long time, those who are considered to be of marginalized groups were not given the opportunity to identify themselves. And having a pride in who you are separate from the world was not a thing that a lot of them got to do because their identities were not accepted. And so I think that now, even though we are, I wouldn't say we're in like a race war or a culture war, but we're coming into this age of like new knowledge where people are kind of discovering things about themselves, and it gives them a sense of pride to know that, I'm able to find out where I come from, because for so long, me and my people had no idea. We were just here, and all we knew was what we were told by the majority. So it's like, while it is important to recognize that as a human race and as a human species, we all have many things in common, but it's also important to recognize that for people who weren't able to identify themselves and be prideful in their soul identity, we kind of would have to give them time to figure out exactly where they come from, be proud of that, and then maybe we can come together and say, now that I know who I am, because for so long you've been able to know who you are, now we can come together and figure out what we all have in common and how we can live cohesively.
I like that.
I see it as all things, since I have so many kids, in terms of like my children, where it's this idea that that for them to be able to actually engage healthfully with one another, and particularly as they grow up and enter adolescence and adulthood, that first they have to be allowed and supported to self-define themselves as they choose. That it's not my job to assign them an identity. It's my job to support their identity as they create it. And simply saying, well, you're just part of the Foley Martinez family, like that completely negates their experience of their own self-creation of the identity that they choose to have in the world. And so while obviously we all have a whole lot of stuff in common, that like coming from like my perspective as a parent, that my first job is to support them as they negotiate figuring out who it is they do and do not want to be in the world, so that they can enter into healthy, dynamic, interdependent relationships later on. That's kind of my, everything comes back to parenting for me. But that's kind of how like I view that sort of struggle and understanding why it can be diminishing to just be like, but we're all just one. Because in some sense, yes, of course, most of our DNA is exactly the same. But that negates that experience of people being their autonomous selves as they choose and define themselves.
Yeah, so I was kind of looking forward to the conversation in part because, and I alluded to it a little bit last week, where people would treat me one way just from like looking at me from an observational standpoint and just say, oh, that's a Black guy. And then find out that my dad was from another country and then treat me differently. And I watched that shift like happen like instantly. So I knew that there was a story that people made up about what it means to be a Black American person, or even if people felt like they could identify with me in some way, then they would try to, their brain might say like, I can't identify with a Black person. So what can I, because they have that partition in their brain. So there may be something else that they say, well, oh, he must be, like Ethiopian or something, like just different things that I've seen, and prayers for Ethiopia right now. But that I've seen happen with that ethnicity, race kind of place, or people will say, well, this is more from the diaspora, the African diaspora, but people who will say, oh, I'm not Black, I'm Haitian. And it's like, now that means that you've now bought into an idea of what it means to be a Black American and what that means from an ethnic and cultural standpoint, that you want to distinguish yourself from that by saying, I'm this or that. And later as we go, I'll tell you a couple of comical and goofy stories of playing around with that awareness. But I've been looking forward to the conversation because I want to kind of just hear and share some thoughts about that idea of how people do use race and ethnicity in weird fashions. So that's why I was looking forward to the conversation. So that was kind of like an introduction. So as we move into round one, if you have that in front of you, if anyone wants to start us off in round one, that'd be great.
Oh man, I looked at I just went over the questions and I looked at the third question. Have you ever claimed an ethnicity that wasn't yours? And I am so guilty of this.
That's actually round two.
Oh, it is round two.
That's round two though. Round one is more along the lines, has the choice to participate in this discussions. We kind of touched on this anyway, but it's more like has the choice to participate in these discussions, brought up any new questions for you as it relates to the topic, like those areas. But I'm glad you're excited about for the next one. I'm looking forward to that too.
Mainly for, I don't know if y'all remember my obsession, due to my dad being a linguist, my obsession with accuracy and definition. And so because these words for so long, even now, have not been clearly defined, thanks to the people that invented them, and did not leave us a clear definition of the terms, right? They just kind of named things and said, here you go. So I look forward to these conversations because we don't have these clear definitions, it's really going to take these conversations for us to come to an understanding of them. And so that would probably be my main reason as to why not only I wanted to have these conversations, but why I'm excited to have this conversation, so that I can either have an understanding and say, well, based on these conversations that I had with a diverse group of people, this is how these are defined. And I can explain it in a logical way, right? Not just say, this is what I think, or this is what people think. And then I also, either that, or I want to come out of this and just say, well, they're not clearly defined. These are the logical reasons why they really should not be used, because they can't be defined. And then we can move on and maybe come up with words that can be defined and we can use, and that can be logically explained and not controversial and oppressive to people.
Mhm.
I would just point out that this conversation would be virtually impossible to have on social media before a bunch of trolls just went after you, random being from the internet. So the genius of this conversation is I hope we're leading by example, and maybe a lot of other people asking the same questions are willing to actually discuss it with the other guy that you're not allowed to talk to. So it's clearly influencing me. I recently started a new video podcast, and one of the goals of that podcast, in large part because of this style format, is to bring on guests that absolutely disagree with many of the fundamental principles that my core audience would embrace. And I don't know if that's going to work or not, but if it doesn't, I'm going to blame Joan Blades, who got me involved in this.
And I've had several new interventions that I started working on this week. People reaching out, or people trying to distance themselves or get out of several different extreme far right groups. And this idea of beyond, more so in terms of ethnicity, or what I understand currently as ethnicity, has been on the table, because part of the whole struggle is this idea of like our European heritage, and and challenging some of the ideas of like, oh well, it must be my German heritage or what. I'm just like, what your grandparents were has no impact on how you choose to relate to the world. Like, using this framework to challenge their idea that I'm like set in stone for how I relate to the world. That, that it's like, dude, that's just an accident of geography where your grandparents came from or whatever. Like, that has not patterned your responses in any way at this point. Like, the people who they were might have impacted. Sorry, my earbuds will not stand. The people themselves might impact you and how you relate to the world, but where they were born literally has nothing to do with it whatsoever. And so I've been, but because we're having these conversations that I've been really thinking through as as I'm talking with these several people, and trying to introduce this this cognitive doubt to the way that they are currently viewing and framing themselves inside the world, to really just to pose questions like, that if you can create doubt, then you can create a cognitive opening.
Yeah, I think we kind of like naturally flowed into the round that Shakira was looking at. And so it's kind of cool. Like, it's kind of like, I think the second conversation after having had the first one with each other, we're naturally kind of flowing into that space. So, and for people who are watching this video in the future, people who may be wanting to have their own living room conversation at some point, to know that you're not bound by the structure. If you're feeling the structure's there to give us guides, but then if we feel ourselves naturally flowing in a certain direction, then I say, just kind of go with it. So getting into the area that Shakira was leading us into, I'll run through the questions just for people who are maybe watching it. And one of them is, how do you understand ethnicity, which we've already started talking about. How would you describe your own ethnicity, and how has it impacted you? Have you ever claimed an ethnicity that wasn't yours, or that wasn't visibly yours in order to pass or have privilege? And then how have race and ethnicity functioned differently in your life if they have? Like if you can see clear distinctions between race and ethnicity in your own life. So we can kind of jump in that there.
As I was trying to think for myself how I thought differently between the two, I had a hard time, you know, we're kind of all having a hard time like defining that, but I think that in my own personal experience, race was often and is still often like a black or white thing, and then everyone else is ethnic, you know, like, and I was trying to think like, how does that make sense, and what does that mean, and where does that come from? And so that's kind of where I've come from in I guess my upbringing and stuff. And is that kind of a common type of a thing, do you think, that yeah, black and white's race and then everything? Because then I started thinking like, oh, okay, so yeah, I guess I just haven't put a lot of thought on this, that the different races of people from different countries are all, you know, different races too. I mean, obviously, but yeah, interesting. And no, I've never claimed an ethnicity that wasn't mine in order to pass or have privilege, because I've had all the privilege. And I really just in these last few years, that has been made really evident to me, that I just don't, like the question at the end of round 2 was, has participating in these conversations affected the way you listen to others discuss these or these topics? Well, so I guess it's only been a week has passed since we talked about it, but like, I haven't really had the opportunity, just like, has it come up? No, I still live in a pretty lily white area. We've got, you know, we have some diversity, but my life is pretty white. But I did have a moment where, and it was like, I think it was the day of this, and we got a Indianapolis Monthly magazine that has all the, where to eat and what to do around Indianapolis and all the fun things. And it had an insert, and it highlighted all these different people and all their different kind of high profile careers, and you know, the top whatever people in Indianapolis with all the cool jobs. There was no color. It was all white people. And it was like, and I just kept turning. I'm like, okay, the next page is gonna have next. And I handed it to my husband, and I was like, look at this, and just, you know, like, what do you notice about this? And I tried not to lead with anything. And he was like, and he was like, oh my God, it's so white. And I'm like, how is this possible in 2019 to have a whole slick of a, and you know, Indianapolis overall is relatively diverse. And I don't know, I was disappointed. I was disappointed and shocking. And just, I've been aware of those things in the past, but now I'm gonna be a lot, you know, more heightened my senses on those things that geez, I don't know. That's all.
Well, I mean, my own ethnic self-definition, I guess, has always kind of been fluid, in the sense that being mixed race and being biracial, but also, and you know, in our previous conversation, I mean, you guys know about me that I, you know, self-consciously identify as being, you know, black and white, and both of those aspects being equally important to my own, you know, personal experience and self-identification. And yet, of course, you know, I'm looked at in general as African American, and African American cultural life is, well, I mean, I would say that African American cultural life is a little bit more readily distinguishable than is just sort of white cultural life, perhaps because white Americans are, first of all, that's the majority demographic in the country, but second of all, so many groups go into that, you know. Of course, there's plenty of diversity in the African American experience as well, on the basis of region, on the basis of generation, on the basis of class. So it's very complicated in all directions. But I can certainly, I think there have been times in my life where I've sort of, if asked, or just depending on the context, I might refer to myself as, you know, multicultural, or which is kind of an odd ethnic moniker because it's almost like saying multi-ethnic in some sense, which I suppose I am. But I've either said something along the lines of multicultural, biracial, or African American. I usually don't go around calling myself white, except to make the point that in calling myself African American, I am by no means putting aside, the white part of my identity. But, in an African American cultural context, it's just more relevant for me to think of myself usually as African American, and there's sort of a cultural language that I'm comfortable with, that I can speak certain experiences, like, getting my hair braided, and eating certain kinds of food, and speaking a certain way, and relating to music and dancing a certain sort of way. These are all things that are, culture is portable, and there are ways in which cultural experience is fluid, and cultural outputs travel from one group to another and experience different permutations. But that said, there's just a general pattern of experiences in the African American experience that allows me to sort of readily identify myself as an African American without, in my own mind, sort of consciously excluding other parts of my identity. So in terms of the label that I have had most frequent occasion to refer to myself as ethnically, I would say African American, and after that, probably biracial or multicultural. But again, it's for me, it's very context specific, because if I'm just in a room by myself, John is an amalgamation of different things, of which the African American ethnic identity is a core part of my larger identity, and I recognize that's what society tends to latch on, to me just on a phenotypic basis, on the basis of my appearance. It doesn't exhaust my sense of ethnic self-identity, but, probably the most common term that I'm likely to use, that or biracial, just depending on what the context may be. It shouldn't be that complicated, I guess, but I suppose it is.
Yeah, Shakir.
I just realized something before I get into what I was going to say prior. John, you just made me think about this tug that we have with being Black. And what I mean by this tug, we have like a love-hate relationship with the identification of being Black, right? For a long time, I think I would say historically the idea of being Black went in this order. You knew that you were different, and there were stereotypes that were put on you by the gatekeepers that then became your identity, whether you agreed with them or not. And then you had a phase where those stereotypes became a reality out of like accepting them, i.e. that whole turning the N-word into a term of endearment, taking it back. We did that with other stereotypes that were then given to us by gatekeepers. And then you had now I think there were steps in between that, but now we're at a point where we're tugging between accepting certain things as Black culture, but then trying to make sure that we only define Black as being a descendant of American slaves, right? So it's like on one end, we want to accept these things that as like a majority we do, right? We are a part of, but we don't want to leave out the people who are Black because they're descendants of slaves, but don't partake in the things that are perceived to be Black habits, right? So it just made me think of like why is that there's such like a game of tug of war between accepting things that are like well known to be of Black culture, but aren't for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So it was just kind of strange. It made me think of that. The question that I wanted to answer was whether anyone has accepted an ethnicity that was not their own. And I've been guilty of that. For reasons not of privilege, but of comfortability. And what I mean by that is this. From age, I think my mother went into the military when I was 4. And so from that age on, I just moved everywhere. And then once I started school, I went to literally a school every year until I got to college. From first grade to graduating from high school, I was at a different place. And so I never felt that I got to identify myself. I had members of my family who only lived in Virginia, which is where I was born. And they had the same friends, they lived in the same areas, they identified themselves as Virginians and specifically from Hampton, and they got to own that. I had people in my family that were born in Jersey and they lived there, and that was a part of their identity. Everyone else, even my mom, like she moved a little bit, but I think she was older by the time my grandmother went in the military. So she got to live a good chunk of her life in Virginia. So even she had roots in this place. And I had only lived here since I was 4. After that, I was everywhere else. And so I never really got to identify myself. When people would ask me where I was from, I'd want to say Virginia, but I couldn't because I knew nothing about this place. I moved when I was 4, and I never stayed in the same place to form an identity. So for a long time when I lived in Maryland, and that was the longest I'd stayed somewhere, I lived there for about 3 years. So I used to say I was from Maryland because I knew the most about it, right? And then at the age of 19, I had started to form a closer relationship with my dad because I lived with my mom primarily. So I had spoken to him from time to time, but we never had that bond. And my father, who was an African linguist and is someone who has taken the time to dive into our history, he was like, well, if you look at where American slaves, those that got dropped off in America primarily came from the western coast of Africa. And so he showed me countries, and he didn't necessarily say pick one and be from it, but just know that more than likely your lineage is going to come from one of those countries on the western coast of Africa. So I took it and I ran with it because I had no sense of identity. And when people would ask me where I was from, I got tired of saying everywhere. I'm from 13 different places because I've moved so much. And so after I graduated from college and I started to gain a better understanding of Black history and even African history, and I would ask my dad, well, have you looked into where you're from? And he said, I've done a blood test, but I mean, those are only as reliable as looking into the internet. So he did it just to do it, but he doesn't necessarily take that as where he's actually from. But some of his blood traced back to Liberia. So when I graduated from college, I would say, well, yeah, I'm Liberian. And it wasn't necessarily to gain privilege, because at the end of the day, I always say that if you are here in America and if you are a descendant of slaves that were, again, imported into America, because I identify Black as just that. When people say like Haitians that come over here are now Black, or Cubans that come over here are now Black, or Puerto Ricans that come in mainly into the States are now Black because their skin color, I don't find that to be the case, because that the people that were identified as Black historically were imported into America. There were Africans that were imported into other places in the world, but those that came into America were identified as Black. But I think I was identifying as Liberian just to have like a sense of belonging. Like I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. And I knew that I was Black because that was how America identified me, but that wasn't satisfying enough to me, especially because I found a lot of quote unquote Black culture to be problematic, that being the level of misogyny, the levels of homophobia, xenophobia, like so many things that come with, or that are perceived to be a part of Black culture, mainly through hip hop. I think I did it as just a way to be different. I wasn't happy with just having that race and not having an ethnicity, or not having like a hometown. And I think a lot of people do it. And I think that's part of the gimmick of like turning in DNA tests to kind of figure out like, you don't have to just be American, you can be something else. And so I think looking at or trying to define ethnicity or have a conversation about ethnicity, ultimately it turns into a conversation of just identity and how lost we are in identifying ourselves. And really the only reason we're lost is because we haven't been given the chance to really identify ourselves. Or and if we have, then who we choose to identify is not acceptable based on, I won't say the majority, because really white Americans are no longer the physical, like they're no longer the quantitative majority. I would say gatekeepers, that being people who are in charge or in the majority of like popular culture. So I would just say it's a mess that I hope we get out.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody else wants to jump in on there, feel free. Otherwise, I'll jump in. 1, 2, 3, me. Okay. So with myself, and I think I might have mentioned this last week, my cousins, some of my Cape Verdean family, when I just would identify as Black, and they would say, well, you know, why do you just say you're Black? And for me, it was because I was born in America, and and even though I was around the language or around the culture, I'm born in the United States. My mom's Black, and Black American. You know, her family came from some other islands and came to the United States too. So it's really complex. But the way I looked at it is, well, like as John said, like if he's sitting there by himself, I don't think he's sitting there saying like, I'm this, I'm that, and other things. He's an amalgamation of a lot of things, as we all are. So I don't think about it really at all. So I think that the categories that people use to identify, I'm like, well, if someone sees me on the street and they say they perceive me as Black, I don't sit around describing myself. So I'm just going to accept that and kind of roll with it, especially if I'm going to get receive what comes with that as a part of being in America. But I also extend that to anyone who is at any point in the diaspora, wherever they got dropped off, that in some capacity they were seen as less than some baseline sense of what makes a person human, and then were taken somewhere else. And so all of us in that diaspora, whether we found ourselves in like Dominica or the Caribbean, somewhere else in the Caribbean, or on the shores of in the United States or whatever, or even back in Cape Verde, it's like we're all part of this like story of disruption to our ethnic cultural heritage. And also many of us were cut off from our language and our linguistic, and I'm going to use the word resonance, and I don't even know if that's going to translate very well. But I actually am a linguist too. I was a linguist as well. And I went to Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and as a Mandarin linguist. And I can say that that there's something to being able to connect and to put yourself into words to tell your story of yourself, and that the languages that we've been given don't really afford us the opportunity to articulate ourselves, because the same language that was used to put us out doesn't have the structure to contain us unless we create new language like you've been talking about, Shakira. And I could say that ironically, when I was learning Mandarin, because of some concepts that were embedded in the linguistic elements of Mandarin, I actually felt more myself speaking Mandarin than I did speaking English, and speaking Creole from my father's country as well. I could feel something in my body where I was able to articulate some elements of who I was, and with the Mandarin, I was more able to articulate my thought life. And so there's something there, but when you've been cut off from that, because your language, your original people's language, has been removed, there's something that happens, and it's a very physical thing as well. And there's a philosopher, Frantz Fanon, which a lot of people know about. I don't know about, because when I ask people, most of the time they don't know what I'm talking about. But but he wrote a book called Black Skin, White Masks. And even in that work, he kind of talked about that idea of the language, for lack of a better expression, the language of the oppressor does not articulate the freedom of the oppressed. So the language itself is a container, you know, and I kind of bring that up because I think that when we talk about like race and who's in this race and who's out that race, it's all based off of the construct of the linguistic container that we use in English. Because some people, they don't have these kind of conversations because their language doesn't have these kind of elements in it. So they can't have these kind of conversations. But when they come into this realm where these distinctions are made and we created language to distinguish each other, then we have these kind of conversations and we get tangled up in it, you know? And so I think that I'm going to stop talking in a second, but I do think that there has to be some kind of movement towards creating a language that's a way of expressing the depth of who we are more expansively, so that we all can find and locate ourselves in the larger culture. Because right now, I think a lot of the argument is a language argument. You know, when we get into it, and when we structured this conversation, that was in mind that this is a linguistic challenge as well. So that if we can address that, then maybe we can like take responsibility for how we hear language just as much as how people speak language, and then come up with something in common that we can kind of connect with. So I'll step to the side now.
Well, that's fascinating for me for a couple of different reasons. I mean, I haven't studied linguistics formally, although, you know, I listened to John McWhorter and Noam Chomsky and people like that a little bit. But I was, you know, raised in a musical family, which I may have mentioned before. Pretty much all of my immediate relatives are artists and musicians, and so music has always kind of stood in as kind of, you know, a metaphorical prism through which I understand many other things, including language. You know, on the one hand, I do feel a deep sort of historic resonance with the English language, and in that sense, I guess you could consider that some ease within myself towards kind of, you know, an Anglophile sort of, you know, ethnic sense of self. I mean, I've never felt like the English language was anything other than germane and resonant for myself. On the other hand, though, I do feel that there is, if I relate language to music and look at music as something that exists in different languages, it's clear to me that different styles of music sort of elicit different responses in different parts of the human being, and that on a cultural level, there are degrees to which certain musical languages translate a little bit more directly in some cultural and ethnic understandings than they do in others. And I've never thought that it was a coincidence that jazz, for instance, and, you know, my family is particularly a jazz family, and I grew up, you know, playing jazz trumpet and so forth. It is no coincidence to me that jazz is sort of a musical form that had to sort of be, I think, germinated from the African American experience, because the rhythms that are involved in it and sort of the nature of the improvisation and so much of the sort of unique expressions of jazz music. It's not African music really, but it's clear that there is, even as our African language was lost for African Americans, the kind of intuitive sort of artistic tendencies, I think, of the people of our ancestors who were brought from that continent sort of reemerges in the music that you see in the Americas. So even as the conscious understanding of language is gone, you see the influence of that sort of cultural heritage sort of reemerging in something that is new. I mean, it's, you know, jazz does have some European influences in it as well, but the heart of it, you know, comes from this sort of, you know, transplanted, I guess, African, you know, artistic intuition. if you will, from the sounds to the music to the rhythms. And that in turn goes and it influences, you know, it influences white American people from all sorts of different ethnic groups. And again, something uniquely American comes from that. I mean, you know, I have a friend who's, you know, African American, but he always tells me that he's like, I look at a guy like you and I just call you American. He says, because you're, you know, you're this, you're that, and the other, you're a combination of things that could have only happened in this country. And so, you know, for me, that's a useful metaphor to understand what it is you're describing, I think, Pedro, because I can imagine some person might listen to what you're saying and think like, well, you know, language is just kind of a functional tool, right? This is, you know, what is the deeper resonance of the language that you have other than that it conveys a message? And maybe some languages are better than that than others, but aren't we just sort of imagining the idea of a spiritual resonance to language? But I feel like I understand you because, you know, again, I look at language through the prism of music, and music, which is a means of communication, essentially, it does carry with it, I think, kind of a pattern of resonance that, you know, may in some respects be universal, but is more easily accessible depending on the category of music to certain individuals, depending on the category of their cultural experience and so forth. Because music is ultimately largely a product of culture, and it doesn't mean, you know, that's not a racial distinction, but it is a cultural sort of, you know, phenomenon. And language is something that exists in tone and in syncopation, and in pitch and inflection. You know, these are all sorts of musical elements. And so, you know, I do think that different languages kind of speak to different parts of the human experience and maybe to different parts of the human individual. And so, you know, but hearing you explain your own perspective in that way brings that to my mind.
I just had a question for Matt, Heather, and Shannon along the lines of like language. We always like the conversation of like how or be of Black identity being problematic in many ways because of like how the differences within Black culture, and there's no like one way to be Black, right? Besides to have melanin in your skin, and even then, everyone that has melanin is not, or at least accurately cannot identify as Black. Have you all ever found like the whole singular white or Caucasian identity to be problematic, considering that like Caucasian is technically defined as those deriving from the Caucasus Mountains, which are technically in Southeast Asia? Like, have y'all ever found that to be like problematic, considering the majority of white immigrants started with the Dutch and then they come from other places that are not Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so let me talk about that a little bit. And by the way, I love the language and jazz metaphor. I think that makes a lot of sense for the process we're going through right now, because the words white identity have a lot of baggage for me personally as a white guy. And you know, one of the questions is, how did you identify growing up, and how do you identify yourself? I don't feel like I've ever identified as a white guy, and I don't know exactly why that is. I touched on this last time. I wasn't really raised with a huge emphasis on where I came from. I was just an American, and we moved around a lot when I was a kid, so I didn't even have sort of a geographic identity. You know, I was young in Detroit, and then we moved to Western Pennsylvania. And certainly Western Pennsylvania is not particularly diverse in its color, but Detroit certainly was. So we didn't do that, but like particularly today in the context of white nationalism and Charlottesville and the alt-right, the idea that I would identify as white is sort of fundamentally offensive to me, because it's linked to this idea that there is this division based on the color of our skin, and there is this sense of superiority that you would hear. I was just sick to my stomach after I watched that Vice. Maybe some of you guys saw it. Vice did that report in Charlottesville, and I was upset that they were giving that guy a platform, but I was also upset that there was at least dozens, if not hundreds, of people that showed up at that rally thinking that being white was special and that we were somehow being oppressed, and we were going to take that back. So for me, this idea that I go back and try to find my identity in the mountains of Slovakia, just south of Poland, which is where I think my grandfather's hometown was. Is not going to change the way I think about being an American. It's interesting. It's sort of fun to know where you came from, but I don't want to identify as the guy that came from there, because I want to get past that sort of tribal identity, because if we're going to be divided by tribes, someone's going to try to get us to fight with each other, either politically or otherwise. I don't know if any of that made any sense.
Makes total sense. I understand it. Yeah.
I was thinking while y'all were talking about language, and because I have the fundamental belief that, like, as we speak, so we believe, so we live, that actually the words that we use pattern our brains in particular ways, and the way that our brains are patterned is like how we live, and that music is also just this powerful manifestation of the way that our music is math, right? Like, and the way that we put it together, math being its own language, that it structures our brains to respond and react and interpret our worlds in particular ways. And I think that that's such a great thing to think about as we look to trying to, if our goal is to build bridges and to grow towards a greater sense of unity, that it really is going to be a challenge of expanding our language to incorporate ideas that don't yet really have expression in the language that we have, and by expanding that we can actually change the way that we think and interact with the world. And I was also really struck by, like, I can't imagine the idea of, I have no disconnection from the traditions and cultures of my family, like even though, I don't speak German, and I don't speak Welsh, and I don't speak Gaelic, and I never did, but there's a continuous tradition that I have, that it was never just like, well, your family's going to just be removed and plopped into the middle of, some place where you have absolutely no ties to linguistically or anything to this place. And so voila, now you have to create your own. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about how, I wonder how much in terms of identity building through, like, ethnicity and stuff like that, how much of it is related to oppression, and that those who either are or perceive themselves to be oppressed have a stronger call to develop some sense of identity within the greater world, that this idea of, like, Black culture, or this, like, this emergence of, like, now we have to define what white culture is, or whatever, that either the real or the perceived ideas of oppression drive the importance of that, so that, like, because you're not allowed to really fundamentally explore your own identity as you define it, because there are oppressive forces that are keeping you from having that freedom to be able to do that, that drives this attachment to particular things, even if you don't necessarily personally relate to all of what's defined as your particular ethnic culture. I wonder about the relationship of oppression to this idea of beyond just, like, racial identity, but as, like, ethnic identity. And I was thinking about what you were saying, Matt, too, about this idea of this I think that one of the things that's going on right now is that there is this drive behind, however we got there, whether it's media influenced or, you know, or whatever, that there are real demographic shifts that are happening and that are about to happen, where um, the the group that hitherto has been the oppressive class is going to become the statistical minority, and that there's a lot of fear around that. Like, what is it going? So, what if we no longer are simply the statistical majority in terms of like our physical appearance or whatever, and we've held all the power? Well, where does that leave us, and what do we do? And you know, that because the idea that white people in America, even though it's coming out in horrible ways, that I find that to be really interesting, because most white people have never thought about their race, and they've never thought about really like their ethnicity beyond like St. Patrick's Day or whatever. Like, so the idea that there is in fact this idea of like racial consciousness among white people happening, to me, I see that as a place where we can do this expansive language, you know, to begin to challenge what that means. And like, why have you never thought about that? Because every person of color in America sure as hell has had to think about their racial identity. So why haven't you had to do that? And what does it mean? And does it matter? Is it significant to you as a white person? So like, I don't, I have a lot of really jumbled and not full thoughts about a lot of this. And Shay, would you remind me what your question was? Because I think I had a thought about that.
I just wanted to know if the white identity and how inaccurate the Caucasian identity actually is, because the Caucasus Mountains are not where half of white people in the country have come from. Has that ever been problematic to move you?
In comment sections all the time, whenever or anything I ever do. But I again, like it shows up as problematic all the time, particularly interestingly with like extreme far right wing commentators, that they object to that distinction all the time. And I don't know, I find that really interesting, this idea of their resistance to wanting to be defined by some external sort of thing. Like I see that as problematic, but I also see it as a point of opportunity to increase dialogue, to expand, like, well, expand what you're thinking about this. Like, think about how this relates in terms of other people. You know, and in the like white nationalist extreme far right land, that there's this idea of a borrowed and fake ethnicity all of the time, in terms of like, you know, we're all like Vikings or whatever. I'm like, dude, most of y'all were not from, you know, the Nordic countries. Like, you know, that's not your heritage. That no matter what, like that is not your real ethnic identity. Like, you're completely borrowing that. And you see that throughout. I mean, even, you know, Nazi Germany, not a Nordic country, like that's not their ethnic heritage. That, you know, this idea of borrowing what we perceive as more powerful ethnicities or whatever, this idea of, you know, that's a really, to me, like, this conversation is, you know, is super interesting to me, because it's making me think more about that, and how and why we borrow ethnicities, and how that functions, and what that means, and how we self-identify, and whether or not, and it speaks so much, like you were saying, Shay, because I relate to moving around a whole bunch as well, but this idea of like, of this self-definition of like connecting to something, a past greater than us or whatever, and understanding our place in the world, and this deep drive to attach ourselves to some identity that is greater than just me, an individual, or even just this is my family or whatever. Like that to me, like that, I think I'll probably spend a lot of time thinking about that and the role of the drive to identify ourselves as attached to a greater identity than just us.
Give it Heather, see if Heather wanted to jump in on it at all.
Yeah, so I don't know if I just live under a rock, but I've never heard that Caucasian came from the Caucasus Mountains. Like, that's not something that so I'm learning things here. Thank you for enlightening me. So obviously that hasn't been, here I'm like just living this clueless life. It hasn't been an issue for me, but I grew up in a family, my dad's side of the family was all Scottish, and his dad came across on a boat when he was, 16 years old from Scotland. And so the whole, like, I'm 50% Scottish. And so like that was my identity. When Shay, when you're talking about your desire to have that ethnicity or whatever to identify with, I never realized how important that was. And just listening to you talk about that, moving every year and not having a place to grow your roots and say, oh yes, I'm from this place that I'm familiar with, and I'm familiar with the people, and yeah, and so like it's just like that, it solidified. That was just like a solidification of our family and our roots and stuff. And so I guess I didn't ever really think about myself as just Caucasian. I was an American that had Scottish roots, and yeah, so simple answer to that question, that has not been an issue for me.
One thing I'll throw out here for us to discuss in our last minutes or however many we have is the idea of how guilt and shame play into how people relate to race and ethnicity. We didn't put that in the conversation, but I think when I originally was asking about people passing and things like that, when I wrote the question, was also, I've noticed it, some people, they will, people who might identify as white will use another cultural ethnicity as a way to distinguish themselves from the enslaver ethos. So they're going to be like, well, my family came over, like if they don't want to be connected to that concept, because they're like, well, I don't want to be connected to this negative side of Americanism, of being from the enslaving group, because I want to be separated from the consequences that come from being white in America. Even though I might get the seeming benefits of being white in America, I don't want any of the negative. And so people, because I've had people come up to me and say, my family's French. Like, hey, thanks. I'm glad to know. So
we came over in the 20s. Don't blame us for that.
Right. And so it's like interesting how we use these concepts of race and ethnicity to draw us towards some things in some instances and away from things in other instances, in order to, in my mind, to navigate that shame and guilt kind of thing that comes along, so that we can find ourselves or locate ourselves as our essential selves. So as we kind of transition into this, if you guys are interested in this part of the conversation, there's this guy named Paul Tillich, and he talked about from the idea of God as being the ground of being. And the reason why I bring it up is because I think that while we do have our differences and everything like that, there is, I think, some way of using that commonality, not necessarily the religious idea of God, but ground of being, like whatever it is that, like the same soil can bring up a whole bunch of different plants, but they all need the soil in common. They all have those nutrients in common to be able to grow into whatever they're going to be. And when people are cut off from the ground of their being or the root of their being, I think it causes those issues. So how can we, as we talk about the guilt and the shame and the other things that we try to avoid, how can we use the essential commonality and the essential humanness as a means of embracing what we have in common and understanding what we have different, and then looking at how we navigate it. So I hope that's not too convoluted, but just throwing that out there.
Yeah. Well, it's No, I was just going to say it's just really fascinating listening to the different perspectives and relating to different perspectives. I mean, Shannon, you asked the question, is there a relationship between oppression and the drive to seek and own one's ancestral identity? And I would say, yeah, absolutely, no question that that's the case. Certainly in an American context. I mean, you know, in myself growing up, I was, you know, at a certain point, I became conscious of the fact that on the white, or more specifically, I actually don't really like the word Caucasian either. I tend to say Anglo because that's specific to a lineage in the European context. But you know, but growing up, at a certain point, I noticed the fact that on the Anglo side of my cultural history, putting my own specific heritage or ancestry aside, I could just tell that in tracing the Anglo and European, the history of that culture, I mean, I can go back generations and generations before the colonization of the Americas, read about kings and queens and popes and take it all the way back to Greece and Rome and prior to. And on the African side of, you know, my, you know, self-knowledge and the education that I received growing up, it's like, you know, got an African-American experience, but before that, it's like nothing, you know. What was like, what do we know about ourselves as descendants of Africa or what have you? And so that leaves Black people in this place where some of them embrace a very sort of American Black identity, others extend their sense of identity to a Pan-African or to an Afrocentric sort of sense of self that actively reaches back to Africa and to an African history for a sense of identity. And, you know, do we or do we not conflate Black and African? I mean, it's you know, it's a subject that I've seen and to a degree have myself wrestled with over time. And then on the white side on the white side of America, such as I have perceived it, there seems to be, in general, put the alt-right or the white nationalist types aside for the moment, there seems to be less of a need to sort of actively identify with some historic ancestry. And I think in simple terms, it's just a case wherein, you know, one group of people actively reaches for that ancestry because it was taken away from them, whereas the other group of people, it was never threatened, really, and therefore they're free to upgrade to something that is more conducive to the moment and to the sense of self that they've adopted in the present time. That is an American identity, right? I hate having to speak in such broad terms, but for white people generally, I think the American identity didn't threaten any previous sense of identity. It is sort of an upgraded sense of self. Whereas for Black people, in some respect, that which is American is literally what took away any prior sense of self they might have had to begin with. And therefore, for many Black people anyway, the very need to reach back and reclaim a historic African identity, or at least a particularly Black identity, also necessitates some degree of rejection, or at least distancing from the sort of artificial kind of construct of American identity, at least as it pertains to Black people, you know? And so for myself, I fall in the middle of that. I very much believe in the type of American identity that Matt describes, but I also believe in the value of my reaching back on both sides of my ancestry to call forth, parts of a larger history that I imagine do inform some sense of who and what I am in this current moment. So I think it's a way to balance it all out. But, you know, the precise kind of formula for each individual, I expect may vary quite a bit according to experience and just personal disposition. And I'd never pretend to have quite like, you know, a universal answer for people in terms of how they ought to go about forming their own sense of self in such a complicated social and historical context. Yeah, 11:35 is good.
Yeah, I was thinking about of course, everything you see in the movies is absolutely true, but there's a movie called Gangs of New York. You guys have probably seen it, which is a ethnic fight between the Irish Catholics and the Americans, and I only bring that up because I think the balance, I think, is the key, because if you look at the history of fascism and all the deadly isms and authoritarians that have used race and culture and identity and religion to do the most horrific things imaginable, I think we have to find that balance of being proud of who you are and where you come from, and acknowledge that as a kid I didn't have to think about being white, because it was not a burden, it was not a controversy for me to be that. But I look at the rise of identity politics, and the most noxious to me as a white person is white nationalism. But I would just be afraid of political demagogues that would exploit that to divide us, and that's why I always, as a libertarian, I always want to get to that commonality. There has to be a balance where we can all be absolutely different. We're all born in different circumstances, and what we do in our lives is what makes us an individual, and we should celebrate that. But we could also celebrate all the things that bring us together through cultural identity, through racial identity. I just want to make sure that in America we don't fall into that trap, and obviously we're seeing some of that today, and that's what worries me.
Well, and I think in terms of the idea of guilt and shame, and tying into what Matt just said too, that there's this, I mean, again, bringing this back to motherhood for me, that this idea that if you, in my own life, that if you do not own up to the exact nature of your wrongs, if we can't like address the real of our nation's history, that we continue to have this like fake idea of our history where it's just heroes and it's not a violent revolution and genociding a nation and building industry on the backs of people that we owned as property, like, because we don't speak in those terms, so we can't, there's never any like healing not real fundamental healing that happens, because we still haven't even admitted that we have a problem, like not the true nature of our problem or the true nature of the history that we are a part of, so that we're always scattering to find a sense of history. My feeling is like we're always scattering to try to find a sense of history that feels like one we can belong to, because we pretend that our history is something that it isn't, and there's no way to actually move towards genuine amends making, because we can't even acknowledge what the real history was. And so I think for maybe y'all saw that thing in terms of like climate change, where it's such a catastrophic thing that our human brains can't even grapple with it. And I sometimes wonder too, if in terms of like, the horrificness of the nature, as we've grown in, many of us have grown in understanding and consciousness about what it means to be human, that the guilt and the shame of like coming to terms with the actions that, even if we're not direct ancestors, but that white America undertook to build this nation, it's almost inconceivable, because it's genuinely horrific. And I wonder if some of that is that, so that, and the idea is that trauma, the understanding that we're growing into about trauma being passed on through our epigenomes, and that it's passed on from generation to generation, and that we store it in our very bodies, and failing to address that. It's like we just go round and round, and we don't talk about having the skill set to release that from all of us culturally. This like cultural liberation from the continued cycle of repeated oppression because we don't put that into our public consciousness. And so it feels like, that we're stuck in this cycle of guilt and shame. And then we are stuck in ways of relating to one another that make us feel not worthy of connecting, and all the ways that shame operates or whatever. So again, this brings me back to the idea that we were talking about earlier of language and like putting words to that, I think would be intensely useful.
So, so we're pretty much at time. We have like a few minutes just to kind of say some final words, and obviously we're going to continue this conversation. But I just want to, before we even go, to say thanks to everybody for sharing as you have, and I think that that it's important what we're doing, and having this conversation. If it stops at us, then it's not useful. So keep having the conversation even after we get online. But if there's any final words that anyone wants to say, or any thoughts, kind of got like a minute each or something like that, to kind of throw some last words out there, that'd be great.
Well, I guess I'll just go and say that, yeah, I mean, the time really flew by very quickly. And yeah, it's just, I second what you said, Pedro. I think it's it's a powerful and important sort of conversation to have. There's a whole lot that I just don't have time to say in response to the things everybody's been saying, that just sort of lets you know how much soil there is to till there. But I do want to say that I do think that there is a level of identity that goes beneath the racial and the ethnic that is more fundamental. And I think the idea of human identity is ultimately transcendent. And I don't mean that in a Hallmark kind of way. I mean that there's a way in which understanding who we are as human beings informs, and I think maybe mitigates, the friction of our differences as members of these different groups. And that doesn't invalidate the significance of those things either. But that human conversation is one that's worth getting to, whenever and wherever we can.
Yeah, thanks.
I think that as a result of this conversation, what I'm beginning to realize is that in addition to either the creation or acceptance of new language as it pertains to identity, I think that a level of cohesion amongst us with a different, with like Pedro was saying with the soil metaphor of the actual division of the soil, because as of right now, the soil is being taken up by certain plants, and then other plants are then either under them or on top of them. We're not all, there's not one piece of flat land that we all have our place in right now. So.
Anybody else?
I've mostly listened today, so I just wanted to thank you all for sharing all of your thoughts, that you have obviously thought deeply about this for longer periods of time than I have. And I just thank you all for your your viewpoints and your perceptions and your different experiences have just like, I don't know, it's kind of like drinking out of a fire hose, so just thank you. I don't want you to think that I'm not engaged or not, I'm just kind of like taking it all in. So I just wanted to thank you all for just allowing me to be a part of this.
No, thank you.
I'll echo that. This is a great conversation, and apparently we have another hour and a half to solve all of these problems. So
Yeah.
we better work our butts off next time.
Yeah, yeah. Shannon?
Well, I've talked way too much today. So just thank you guys for just being willing to be here and engage. And I'm leaving with so many, you have no idea what's been going on in the background as we've been talking, that I'm leaving with so many more questions and challenges, and I feel very challenged about how I'm thinking about everything. And just thank you all for your vulnerability and authenticity and sharing yourselves. Like, thank you so deeply.
Yeah, and yeah, again, thanks to all of you, and thanks in advance to the people who will watch this video in the future. If you go to livingroomconversations.org, you can find this conversation set and work on it with yourself, with other people. And you don't have to have just one and then the second one. The second one, if you need to go deeper and say, let's talk about race more, let's talk about ethnicity more, let's, you know, there's lots of different ways that we can work with these guides. So for the people who will be watching, thank you as well. My final words, besides those of appreciation, is to kind of, I hope that between now and the next time that we all talk, that we kind of pay attention to the environments that we're in, even if we're not saying anything, but just being witnesses, and kind of seeing how the things that we've talked about today and last week are showing up in our world, and witnessing how we might be influential in creating possibilities of engagement between people who on the surface appear to be different, but are in some capacity emerging from that same essential humanness and that desire to know and to be known. And that those things don't necessarily have to violate one another, but can enhance one another in some capacity. Because I feel like I'm enriched by everyone today. And like John said, he saw some of himself in all of us, and I see the same thing. And hopefully all of you can say the same thing. So thanks for your time, and look forward to our next, but maybe not final conversation. And we have each other's contact information if you want to expound offline too, so we can do that as well. So thanks everybody, and see you soon. Okay. Bye.
Take care, folks.
Yep.